open source research experience. And I very quickly give a summary of what I'm trying to achieve here. I want to convince you that you should care about open source very much, that it's a major force in industry, and that getting involved in research at the University of California is one of the best ways to learn how to be productive in open source communities, and to learn the skills of and the best practices on how to interact with open source communities.
Excuse me, Carlos, can I get you to introduce yourself and Stephanie, and then move into?
Yeah, I was going to, that was the next. Before I do that, I like to quickly introduce Stephanie and me. I'm an adjunct professor at UC Santa Cruz. My background is storage systems and practical reproducibility of computer system experiments. But I also founded the Center for Research in Open Source Software in 2015. That is actually, and that experience of over the last 7 years, 6 to 7 years, is key to what we're talking about today. And Stephanie Litti.
Yeah, hi, I'm Stephanie Litti. I am the assistant director working with Carlos at the Center for Research in Open Source Software. And my function at one of my main functions is to work on programs like the one that we'll talk about today, the open source research experience, and organizing it and reaching outreach to students and mentors, as well as other aspects of helping our mentors kind of work with students. So, and I'll talk about a little bit about that more later. My background is actually social science. I was a senior researcher at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies, so a completely different area of expertise for about 15 years, but definitely got into this with definite interest. Overlaps I saw between social science work and computer science work in the area of open source.
Cool. Thank you, Stephanie. And so let's dive right into it. I think let's see whether this works. Oh, there we go. So before I go into the open source research experience, let me give you first a very quick and very simplified history of open source and what open source is. For a really great overview, I highly recommend reading the article in Wikipedia about the history of free and open source software. But very simplified, open source began with the need to be able to fix software. In the 60s and 50s, hardware was delivered with software and software code, readable open source code. And people regularly fixed the software for their needs, and that was later changed. And companies came up with the business model of actually having closed source. So it was actually, today it's not really possible to fix Microsoft Word because you can't access the source code. And so these communities that build and share fixable software are basically what we call today open source communities. This is started out as a sort of a practice, it had sort of the image of a hobby that people did after their work. Then there was sort of a little bit more effort into these communities. They created a new kinds of software licensing, which is called open source software licensing, that encouraged participation in these communities, but also protected the derivative work in a legal sense, and then also encouraged adoption, right? And if you look at open source licensing today, there is sort of this tension between protecting derivative work and encouraging adoption by the industry. This by itself is a long lecture, and so there's And so, but with this open source software licensing, there was a legal basis for that software to have protected status, and the industry started interacting with that. And what then emerged is that these communities, that build and share fixable software, actually moved a lot faster than any individual company. And so this was very much enabled by the internet. So it's very easy to share software over the internet. It turns out it's also very easy to collaborate at massive scale over the internet. This is enabled by distributed revision control systems like Git. There are lower barriers for combining efforts in open source communities, which leads to a much faster cycle of innovation. And the larger the community, the more stable and sustainable these efforts are. So think of the Linux kernel, for instance. Those are communities are incredibly stable, and they attract a lot of funding. So this leads to the state today where industry really values organizations who know how to engage with open source, right? And this is not only companies, but also other organizations like foundations and universities. And so my point is that it's time for universities to really learn how to engage with open source. And we've been working on this for like about 6 years. Just to make this an even clearer point of what that actually means when I say industry values open source, there are $100+ billion valuations of open source companies. There are, there's an index called the Commercial Open Source Index that tracks 50 companies that make at least $100 million a year. There's a total of $14 billion in VC funding raised for open source companies. It's over 76,000 employees. The total estimated valuation of these companies is $237 billion. And then so far these companies sold to bigger companies at a rate of $90 billion, right? So this is significant amount of money that flows around open source. And this is just a small part of the companies that basically make their business model around open source. There are other indicators that of value of open source to the industry. One is the Linux Foundation.
The Golden California Roll and State.
What was that? Oh, somebody maybe. Okay. So there's the organization of the Linux Foundation. So just to get an idea of how much money flows into that organization, it received recently $10 million in new funding into the OpenSSF, which is essentially the sub-organization of the Linux Foundation responsible for the supply chain of software. As you probably might have read, is that has become a real security problem, that software dependencies get corrupted and hacked. And so there's a real big effort now going into this to make this more secure. There's very high level meetings in the White House about these things. So Linux Foundation has a real meaning to in the US and also worldwide. So there's many Linux Foundation members. You look at the logos of those companies; they are very, very well known. So this is very mainstream, right? And then these are the companies that there are 75 companies and counting that are critically dependent on open source ecosystems. So these are not companies necessarily that build around an open source project, like I mentioned earlier, but these are companies who depend on open source software a lot. So Samsung, for instance, announced that 87% of the software that runs in their TVs is actually open source. And so, you know, these are an amazing amount of companies with a $14 trillion total market cap. All I'm just throwing these numbers out there that you have sort of a sense of what that means when industry values organizations that know how to interact with or engage with open source. These companies have invented a new institution that is becoming very popular, and it's called the Open Source Program Office. The Open Source Program Office is something within the company that manages the interaction and tracks the relationships with open source ecosystems. And when I say open source ecosystems, think of it sort of the like the Linux operating system and all the things that come with it, right? That are sort of grouped around it, whether it's a window manager or some set of tools or everything. It's sort of a loose term of interconnected open source software projects that depend on each other. And so these ecosystems some of those are very important to companies, and they have, they're hiring people, they put real resources into making sure that those ecosystems are healthy, that they are, that they have legal protection, and that they, you know, that they also educate the people within the company to properly interact with these communities. There's an umbrella organization called the todogroup.org. We are members of that group, and it's very interesting to see sort of how the industry evolves around these in managing these open source projects that they are depending on. But what about in universities? You know, what would an OSPO or an open source program office look like in a university? And the more general question is, how would any university demonstrate that it knows how to engage with open source, right? And that would basically, you know, be very valued by the industry, right? As we've seen. And so this is the interesting thing is the mission of a company, of a corporation, is to make money, right? That's what they do, and they do really well. The university's mission is different. We teach, we do research, and we provide public service. And it's this public service part that's actually particularly important in this context, where, you know, the University of California, but also, of course, other universities disseminate research results and translate scientific discovery into practical knowledge. And it's this tech transfer or translation of research, which is, you know, that's really important, that we don't just keep all the knowledge within the university, but the knowledge actually flows out and becomes of practical importance to society, and becomes a benefit. Right, and this is where we see essentially open source play a big role in that. So I'm really happy that UC Santa Cruz was one of the 4 universities that got recently selected by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to create a playbook for such an OSPO within the university. The other ones are Johns Hopkins, University of Vermont, and Rochester Institute of Technology. So we're the only one in the West Coast so far. 3 are near you on the East Coast. And in fact, University of Vermont was just selected, just like us, and they just started in January. So this is a very, very new effort. But it's based, at least in UC Santa Cruz, it's based on across the Center for Research in Open Source Software. That is part of the UC Santa Cruz Baskin Engineering. And the lessons that we took, this was, you know, I founded this in 2015, as I mentioned, and we raised $2.6 million from industry, from companies, because we had an open source project that we released and that became very successful, which is the Ceph distributed storage system. And Ceph is now backed by Red Hat and is in a tremendously powerful and very popular storage systems. both in industry and in scientific communities. But the other thing is that we relearned that by connecting sponsors, cross fellows, which are PhD students and postdocs, and students who are just looking for projects, like undergraduate students and master students, we can get really good things going. So we can do this really well around open source projects, right? So open source projects are these catalysts that bring these three stakeholders together. And Stephanie is going to talk more about the details of such a program and how that works. So the key idea of an OSPO, or an open source program office within the university, is to amplify research impact via open source, right? And so you have, in general, your open source research products. Let's say you have published some papers, but you also have some kind of open source software, let's say, right? And it's something that you might even license as with an open source license. You put it on some GitHub server, right? But then nothing happens typically, right? So in order to actually have it thrive, you need to do actually a lot of work to create a community around it. And it's only when that community really gets bigger, then really cool things happen with these open source ecosystems. So that's, and that's when you can amplify the research impact. Your product, which might be software, right, it's not enough to just put it out there, but you have to actually create people to interact with it, to use it, and so forth. And then it becomes part of a community that's larger than the university. So an emerging playbook for such an OSPO is that we focus on amplifying research impact. We don't focus on the same things as an OSPO in industry, right? We develop scalable programs that span not only the campus of UC Santa Cruz and all its divisions, but also other UC campuses. So University of California has a number of campuses all over California. The most famous one are UC Berkeley, UCLA, UC San Diego, UC Irvine, UC Santa Barbara. Let's see, there is UC Riverside, UC Davis, UC San Francisco. So I probably didn't get them all, but there you get the idea.
Our newest.
What was that?
UC Merced, our newest.
Oh yeah, Merced, UC Merced. Thank you. And so I think that this is a big university, and so we make sure that those programs actually scale across many of those campuses. And we want to have these programs inclusive and worldwide outreach. So when we say these programs scale over these campuses, that means that the mentors of those programs or the researchers are within UC, but that the outreach to get students is worldwide and inclusive, and everybody can, we want to lower the barriers of participation as much as possible. We also want to actually get sustainable funding models, right? And we can do this, and we have demonstrated this with broad engagement in industry and foundations. Sorry, there's a spelling error. So and we do this by essentially demonstrating that we know how to train students to be successful and productive in open source communities. This is highly valued now by industry. It's hard to hire. And so this is basically what the key goal of the open source research experience. And I give this over to Stephanie, who's going to tell you more about it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos. One of our key programs within the new OSPO, and it started actually still under the Center for Research and Open Source Software, our existing research center, is this open source research experience program. The history of it really started with the Google Summer of Code. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And we, as part of CROSS, became mentor organizations within that program. And it kind of gave us, and Carlos touched on this a little bit, that gave us the kind of a greater understanding of how students can seed and help jumpstart contributor communities within academic open source products or projects. And that was just, I think we had seen that a little bit in our own work in some of the projects we were supporting in the early parts of CROSS, but definitely when we started as a mentor organization at the Google Summer of Code, we saw that, we saw how that really expanded, how bringing in new students was great, not just for the students who were gaining awesome skills that were very valuable to them as they moved on with their career, but it also was great for our mentors. And I think, I know a lot in the very beginning, some were like, oh, this was going to be like onerous or difficult. But in the end, a lot of our mentors were happily surprised how beneficial it was to them to have these new contributors coming in from different universities and different students that came in. So I'll talk about a little bit of that's a little bit of the history in a second, and also how we expanded it into our own program, which is still interconnected with the Google Summer of Code. But I also want to just say, like, what one of the big things that we have is that this really one of our big reasons for this is that we decided to create the open source research experience itself, and not just stick with working with Google Summer of Code, is that we do like making it scalable. And one of the biggest issues that I think we saw with Google Summer of Code is that we had mentors, but we didn't have, and we had students, but so we had to like create another opportunity that increased our ability to match more students and more mentors in a ways that was really valuable and helpful to both. So the open source research experience started, well, let's just going back, we started as a Google Summer of Code mentor organization in 2018. So we had 2 years of experience as Google Summer of Code mentor organization, which was, like I said, very, very impactful for us. And in 2020, 2020 changed a lot of things. And one thing it changed for us was our recognition that a lot of students really needed remote work. And GSOC is established as Google Summer of Code, also known as GSOC, is established as an organization, sorry, Carlos, can I go back to the last slide?
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
I was like, oh wait, do I have something on there? So GSOC as an organization, it's all remote. So we were trying to like work through ways of increasing the number of students that we could help, and pairing them up with, since a lot of their internships had been canceled, we thought, well, let's try and do something a little different this year, and not just focus on not just GSOC, but how can we expand it so that we can help more students? So that's kind of the history of it. That's okay. Actually, Carlos, don't worry about it. We can, okay. And then, well, I'll talk to this. So what's great about the OSRE, for, as I said, for mentors, is it helps jumpstart the contributor communities. And what is great we've seen what's over the last few years, what's great for students is that really get to work with top scientists and as their mentors. And again, Carlos, I think mentioned this a little bit, but we actually are able to make this a global outreach for our mentors to get students from all over the world. So not just UC students. So Carlos, you can do the next slide. So I just want to say, who are we connecting? And this is a kind of Carlos already mentioned this, and this image was in one of his earlier slides, but I just want to reinforce that this is who we're connecting. We're connecting our researchers at UC. So as Carlos said, we are now open to all UC campuses, plus all the labs that are connected to UC, all the national labs. And those we consider our mentors. And those mentors work with students from everywhere in the world, both UC students and non-UC students. And those students get to spend their summer really working on exciting open source projects. And what we brought in from our experience or that's different from our experience from Google Summer of Code, is that we expanded the type of organizations and the number of organizations that can actually interact with those other two stakeholders. In the GSOC model, it's only Google. It's only Google Summer of Code, Google Open Source Office that's interacting with them. Whereas we have now expanded to allow other sponsors to also support this work. And it's been, I think, very successful over the last 2 years. Next slide. So I'd like to just start by saying, reaching out a little bit first to students and seeing and kind of talking about what student contributors, who they are, what they get from this activity. And then I also will go in a little bit more about the details about application processes and how we work with students in a couple later slides. But feel free to shout out or stop me if anything's unclear, and if you have specific questions about any aspect of the program throughout. So our student contributors are typically undergraduate students, and they, again, can be from any university. We've had, and I'll show you some stats from last year, but we've had typically been international students that we've worked with through GSOC in particular, but also definitely US-based students and a few UC students. Actually, statistically, we actually probably have only worked with maybe 25% of our students working since we started with GSOC have been from a UC. And we've had, so since, and I'll just, for numbers, we've had about 25 students that we've worked with in this program up till now. Now these are paid either full or part-time positions that last over the summer. And that whether it's a full-time or part-time typically depends on what size of the project. We have a large or medium-sized project, and I'll talk about how that's indicated in a later slide. And although it's remote, and I said that was one of the reasons why we kind of came up with the OSRE specifically, was that we thought we needed to do that to help students in 2020. But what is really interesting is because we do it for multiple students and do also have GSOC slots and a lot of different students working together, you are part of a student is part of a larger cohort and a larger community. So you have a cohort of students working on a bunch of different projects and all open source. And you also have the community, so that may be different open source projects or open source products, but you also have a community that your open source community that you're working with. So your mentor and the mentor's other contributor community. So it's kind of nice. And so even though it's remote, you do have interactions with colleagues, you have meetings, you have daily like check-ins and the like. So it's definitely not something where you feel like, oh, I'm just working by myself behind my computer every day. Now, and the main focus is to really, for the students, is to productively engage with an open source community on an open source project and build valuable skills. And we've definitely seen that with all of our participants in this program. They've all kind of commented back the benefits that they've gotten from working with their mentors and having a very productive project that they worked on. And again, as I mentioned before, you get the opportunity to be mentored by top experts in the field. So again, these are UC students. You can go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about the mentors. Oh, sorry. Yes, I forgot. And another one I want to point out. Sorry, I forgot how this slide was organized. Is that we also focus very heavily on creating a diverse set of contributors, and this is really essential for the success of open source projects. And this is something that's been dealt with throughout the open source world, throughout the open source communities, throughout, basically on all different types of technologies, is that the concern about the lack of diversity in open source and how we're taking concerted efforts to change that. So accessibility, equity, and inclusiveness is really important part of the OSRE and how we make decisions, especially in the last few years, where this is something that we've made as a focal point. And we've also, to do that, so it's not just inclusivity in the sense of like opening and having more diverse group, but we also want different experience levels, because we want to bring in people who have never worked in open source before, and so that they can expand their capabilities within open source. So we've asked our mentors and had them look at different types of activities that could be done that span different experience levels. And so they can be really well suited. So we have ones that are well suited for very advanced students who really want to be coding and working on, you know, higher level, let's say higher level technical work. But they also have projects, the project ideas, and I'll explain what that is in a second, that are perfect for those who are new to either coding or open source. So we try and get that the whole range. Right, next slide. So who are our mentors? And I think this is something I think that's unique with our with this program. They are typically, they're all faculty, researchers, or graduate students. We have a lot of PhD students that are our mentors, and they're actually some of our, I think our, I don't want to like, you know, I don't want to like dish any particular part of our mentor program, but I've noticed that I feel like a lot of our PhD students are the most energetic, and a lot of them are working. They're mentoring folks who are working on a project that's very near and dear to them, their PhD dissertation. So I think that's been a really good reason for success for a lot of our projects. They're all working on some sort of academic open source product. And that could be any range of technologies, any range of topic areas. And they kind of, we because we've opened it up also to all our UCs, we're getting a very wide range of different types of projects. So again, these are the 4 UCs that are working with us this year, and we hope next year to hit, you know, like our aim is to get all 10 on here. Right now it's UC Santa Cruz, Go Slugs, UC Riverside, the Berkeley Labs, which is part of UC Berkeley, and UC San Diego. And their reasoning for doing this, and for among other reasons, a lot of them just really want to support students. They want to support open source, but a lot of them really see it as a great way of attracting talented students to their open source communities. And that's the feedback we get a lot. So building their contributor base. So that, I mean, so those are the mentors that the students get to work with. Next slide. And this is our a little bit from last year. We've done it altogether 2 years with the open source research experience program. The first year, 2020 was a little bit, learning a few things that how scaling from just working with GSOC to working with different sponsors, get a learning experience. I think everything in 2020 was a learning experience for everybody. But definitely last year we saw the fruits of our efforts from the year before. The QR code there is the link to the story that talks a little bit more in detail about the results of the 2021 program. But that year we had 9 students, and they were mentored by 13 mentors from 4 separate open source projects or products, depending. And then, and so that's a good thing to point out, is that you're not just students who are not only working with one mentor. We try and pair them up so that there's always some continuity if there's a problem with the mentors. Again, as you see, this year we had more students than ever from UCSC. So we had 4 students from UCSC, but we had 5 international students. And at the end, they all highlighted all their work got highlighted at our fall research symposium. And this last year, 2021, we had four sponsors. So 3 extramural outside sponsors: Google Summer of Code, IRIS-HEP, and Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is part of the Linux Foundation. And then we also had 1 sponsorship through the Baskin School of Engineering that I'll talk a little bit more about later. Next slide. All right, and this year, again, we are members. We are mentor organization for the Google Summer of Code. And why this is great is that it is really a great basis for us to get more student slots, because we know we have a kind of guaranteed number. from that, and that we can just build on with other sponsorships to expand that number. And this year we have, because our mentor numbers are significantly higher, having opened it to UCs, we're really looking to see, I think last year we had just 5 or 6 GSOC mentors, GSOC students. This year, because we have doubled the number of mentors, we also expect to have double the number of slots, or we'll be able to ask for that much. So, so this is the platform that we work through as part of our participation in the Google Summer of Code program. Next slide. This is a little bit clearer of what's important out of that page. And again, the QR code is for this page. So the little arrow where I have the little arrows, one is just our website that gives us some general discussion about cross. But there's also, if students who are interested in, and this is both for faculty, both for the faculty who are on the call and the students. So faculty, if you know students who might be interested in, these are the URLs to look at. One is the guidance, basically telling students how to apply, and the other one is the ideas list. And I'll talk about it. Next slide. All right. So this is where kind of the key part of the whole program I feel like turns on. These are the project ideas that the mentors create so that students can base a proposal for their application. So that's how the project works. And anybody who's worked with GSOC, the Google Summer of Code, will recognize that that's the model that they follow. So mentors who are working on open source research projects, and our mentors, so UC affiliated folks, look at their projects and see what type of kind of discrete, useful contribution someone can make over a 10 to 12 week period, and they create a project idea. And I'll show you that in a second, what one of those look like. And the project ideas are then looked at by the students through this open source project idea list that we have on GitHub. And the student looks at it and discovers the ones that are interesting to them, that they think they could do, or they think they could, if they learn a few things, they could benefit from doing over the summer. And they work together. And this is a key part of the whole experience and a key part of why it's successful. Students and mentors work together before the application goes in. And that's really, really big. Next slide. I'll come back to this in a second. So this is what a project idea looks like. And I want to make sure it's clear when we talk about project ideas for the OSRE, what we're talking about. So there'll be very discrete little kind of overview of the main product, the main open source product. And then under that, there'll be a number of project ideas. The idea that projects that are doable by a student of varying levels of capability over, like I said, a 10 to 12 week period. And you see in here all of the details that you'll need if you're looking for something for yourself, or if you know students, for the faculty on the call, students who are would be interested to doing this, what skills they need, whether it's a difficult one or a reasonably less difficult, skill level, challenging. I think we have medium and challenging are the two, and then easy kind of beginner ones as well. And then also the amount of time that's taken. Typical, we're basing this on the GSOC, what the GSOC requirements are, just to keep everything in kind of consistent, and they call medium or large, or which they consider like part-time or full-time. And I think this is just if a student comes to the idea page looking for ideas for how to contribute to one of our projects, these are the types of ideas that they're given. And then the students are going to use this as a basis for a proposal for the OSRE/GSOC activities for the summer. And next slide. All right, so students see that little blurb or that little like paragraph or so from the project mentor, they start creating their proposal based on our template, and then they submit the application. And I'll talk about a little bit of that in a second, which is that we want them to actually, a little different from last year, everything's going to be submitted through the Google Summer of Code platform. And then mentors get to pick their favorites. And we discuss how many slots we have, and then the coding begins. I'm going to go into all of that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. Carlos. Thank you. So how do you apply, or how does one of your students apply? First, like I said, review that ideas page, and that's where all the core information is going to be. And you reach out to students, reach out to the mentors. I'd love to hear from faculty or students who are on the call about how they think that whole outreach part can be made easier for students. We definitely have a lot of students that jump on and start reaching out to mentors. But we also have students I know that are probably a little bit like, I'm not sure if I'm, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to explain myself well, or I feel a little inhibited to do this. If there ever a students like that, I always tell them to talk to me first, and I'll make sure the introductions go smoothly. And this is the application template. Again, the QR code is for that page that has all the details. And you develop the proposal, the students develop the proposal with the mentor, and it's a back and forth iterative process that happens. It's starting now until the April 19th deadline. So there's still definitely time to get involved for students who are interested. We're getting a lot of interest, but really the next 2 to 3 weeks are the times when we're seeing more students that are interested. The next slide. Sorry, my slide changed slightly. So student applications are due on, the applications are due on the 19th. The portal to be a GSOC contributor, which is what all of our applicants need to kind of sign up as, opens on April 4th. And this is, again, the website where you do that. It's the actual registering as a GSOC contributor is relatively simple. It's and then that allows you to be considered for all of the slots that we'll have. So the reason we did it this way, again, it's a consistency thing. I think we discovered last year that trying to have a separate GSOC kind of process and a separate OSRE was too difficult for the mentors to kind of comprehend, and also confusing for students. So just saying like, okay, everybody has to apply through GSOC, and we'll review you, knowing that we have GSOC slots as well as other sponsorship slots, has just made the whole process easier for everyone. So, and it's a really great, really user-friendly platform. So I don't have any problems asking everyone just to put everything in through the GSOC platform this year. Next slide. And we're running low on time, so I wanted to give a few minutes at the end. Speaking of other sponsors, as I said, it's not just GSOC. And we have another number of other sponsors that we consider when we're looking at applications. So you may get a slot that's specifically supported through our Google Summer of Code status, but we have other sponsors. And one I really want to highlight today is our own school, Baskin Engineering, which this year has committed to a sponsorship that specifically is open for HBCU and minority serving institutions for students from those schools. And I want to give a shout out to Carmen Robinson, who is the head of our Inclusive Excellence Hub, who was able to arrange that this year. And she couldn't be on this call today, but she definitely has been spearheading a lot of these efforts within Baskin Engineering to have more outreach and more interactions with HBCU students. So this was definitely a great thing that she was able to work with us on this year. And they also supported a fellowship last year that was actually more for a graduate student. And this year we were able to get funding for undergraduates as part of the OSRE. And so that's, for me, pretty exciting, because it increases the range of options for students from HBCUs, because you can also be considered under the GSAC program, but now we also have this specific sponsorship that's meant for students from HBCUs and minority serving institutions. So it's really exciting. And again, these will all go through the same process. It won't be any like extra thing you have to do to get considered for this. It will all be all of the applications going in. We will see which universities are represented and which students are eligible for this particular sponsorship. So I think that is the last slide. If I recall correctly. Next slide. Oh wait, timeline. Sorry. This is important too. Again, we'll go straight to the what we're doing right now in March, which is we're in the March to the April period where students are currently working with mentors, and new students can also still come in and start working with mentors. Mentors know the next 2 weeks are going to be crunch time, so they're replying to students in a very timely manner. And if they don't, they get emails from me saying, please respond to your students more quickly. And so applications go in through the GSOC portal April 19th. In the month of May, we start really talking with mentors about who their favorites are, who they think are the best fits. And then by May 20th, we announce our slots. Next slide. And then everything gets going. We have that May period. We have what's called in the GSOC terminology of the bonding period, which is basically an introduction to the community. This is not a paid part and it's not fully required. I mean, obviously a lot of students still have classes in this part, but we try and get like some sort of onboarding done prior to the actual start of the program. And then the program starts in June. Again, there is, as I say on the bottom here, we have a lot of flexibility on start dates and end dates, depending on student and mentor needs. And then you're working with your mentor through these, like I said, 10 to 12 weeks. And by September, we expect really the projects to wrap up and have final valuations. And the greatest part at the end, I think, is that in October, we invite all of the students to our open source research symposium. And they either give a lightning talk or are part of a workshop where they did talk about the work they did over the summer with their cohort, with their and also with their community, with their open source community. So that's definitely been a great way of highlighting all the great work that the students have done. And again, these are students actually contributing directly. So the mentors are also integrating their work into their presentation, saying this is the contribution that my students have done. And that's been great. Next slide. Yes, that one was the last one. So, all right, thanks to everyone. And this is some of the basic information if you need to reach us, either Carlos or I. And we'll have an OSPO website soon that will have all the links. But right now, everything's running off of the CROSS website, and that's the URL right there. And Carlos, do you have any other closing remarks?
Yeah, I just made some of the key points in the comments you might have seen. I just want to reiterate that one of the beauty of the Summer of Code structure is it's scalable because the mentors and the students, when they get together around interesting project ideas that are of mutual interest, they are deciding essentially whether there's a good match, right? So we don't decide that, or nobody else decides that. It's just that we are trying to just raise as much money as possible to fund the students, either through Summer of Code, Google Summer of Code, or through other means. And we try to support mentors and students as much as possible to get involved. But actually, where the rubber hits the road, where there's a lot of the decision, do I want to work with this mentor, or do I want to work with a student? That's really where it's highly distributed. It's across all the mentors and all the students, and then they decide basically who they want to work with. And so that's, I think, is one of the key aspects of why year after year, and Google Summer of Code is now 17 years old, I think. every year has been a great success, and mentors and students really like the program, right? Because they had a really good experience, because they were able to choose. And I think that, so I can highly recommend trying to get involved, and we will definitely, as Stephanie said, facilitate any contact making and introductions, as much as we can do.
Could you go back one slide, please?
Sure. Let me
Back up
see
one
whether this might be difficult. Let me see. I think the trick is this way. Do you see this one?
That's it. Yes, thank you. Make sure we get those dates.
Oh,
Yeah.
and yeah, I think the link, I'll make sure, yeah, I can also add these to the website, so that's an easy link.
Good.
I needed to this is an update from what's on the website. I need to change.
Thank you.
But and then sorry, there was, oh, and I do want to highlight, although I really would love students to only look at CROSS for this and the OSRE for this, the Google Summer of Code in general, which is just I can drop the link on, and it's one of the QR codes that were on the earlier slide, has a huge number of different areas for students to look at. And so any student that, if you look at our list and you're like, well, it's not something I particularly am working on or interested in, it's GSOC has like 300 or 400, no, that's too many, 250-ish organizations of, all different types that students can work with. So like I said, I want everybody to work with us, or look at us, but obviously we don't have everything that every student wants to work on. And I think this is definitely in general, there's like a special shout out, a good shout out to our colleagues at GSOC who do a great job at getting a good range of students and all the other open source projects. Now those open source projects aren't typically, right, other organizations are not typically academics. I think at most maybe 10% of the organizations have an academic or like a part of a university. Most of them are actual open source, open source project or a foundation working on open source products. So it's good, but it's definitely a really, really great program for students. And again, it's all paid. And so it's for students, it's not a free internship. That's like a key part of it. That's really great. So
it would be good to leave that QR code slide up for a moment.
oh, sure. Yeah.
But in general, your slides are available on the
Right.
site though.
I'll make sure that I get them to the organizers.
Okay.
I don't think we gave them to them yet.
Oh, let's see.
What happened there?
Let me I did have to actually go put this on a different screen in order to go to navigate. So I think I'm gonna leave this slide up here. So does this work?
Okay. Yes.
So this is basically how this is become a GSOC contributor, right? And so that's basically where students apply. I think they need to create an account, right?
Yes.
And then
the account's open, like I said, the accounts, the ability to create a contributor account starts in, right.
Yeah.
And that's the actual website right there. And then I also put our OSRE one there in a second.
Great.
Sorry, I didn't think I should have had that like keyed up so I could just add these to the.
Good.
Let me get the link for this real quick. And so the other one
and if you look for our organization, it's under CROSS, right? So it's not OSPO or OSRE, it's CROSS.
Yeah, it's CROSS. That's a good one to mention. And I'll put the link that's to our specific thing. That's a little bit longer link, but that's our page within GSOC.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have pages on our website, but all the links that you would need to our website are actually on the CROSS portal from GSOC as well.
So if you all could send your slides to Dr. Doswell, Felicia Doswell, then she can make sure they're distributed to the proper people.
Okay, great. I'll make sure I do that.
We're at 3 o'clock right now, but if there are any quick questions, please ask them at this point. So I have one question. The program is virtual this year. Is it always virtual? Has it always been virtual?
Always been virtual. The only time we have, well, actually, it's always been virtual. And but this year, if there happens to be students that are local, and depending on the mentor, we will allow it. But it's more the mentor student discussion if they want to. But by definition, it's a remote. It's remote.
Okay.
And the GSOC's always been, because like I said, most of the time GSOC students are not in the same country as the mentor. I mean, that's like, I think the vast majority are like that.
Yeah, we don't have any plans to to provide housing for students if they want to other places. Right?
So approximately how many students are you all looking to hire this summer?
I would say, I mean, that depends on a little bit on what the number of slots we get particularly from GSOC, but I think our aim is to double what we did, well, close to double that last year. I think my aim was around 15. But if we are able to get more sponsorships, the only limitation is the sponsorships, because we have definitely a good amount of mentors who are interested in working. So if we can get between 15 and 20, that would be great.
And we have for the first time also industry sponsorship this year.
Yeah.
So,
And we're hoping to get more. So but that's still being worked out. So I mean, we're still in those discussions. So hopefully we'll get even more mentors. I mean, sorry, even more sponsors.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming to and presenting to us about your interesting program. And there were many faculty members on this in this session. And so what we'll do is get those slides to the faculty members so that they can talk to their students about this program.
That would be great. Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Welcome.
Everyone, have a good afternoon to all
Back for
y'all.
the rest of the conference.
Bye.
Bye-bye.